The maternity wing of St. Gabriel Medical Center smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm plastic, the sort of scent that clung to the air in places where lives began and sometimes ended. Outside delivery room 214, Eleanor Whitaker sat rigidly on a narrow vinyl chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the knuckles had turned white. Moments earlier the door had slammed shut in front of her, and the words that followed still echoed painfully in her ears. "Please take her out of here. I don't want her in this room." The request had not been whispered. It had been sharp, desperate, and loud enough that two nurses and a passing doctor had turned their heads. The young nurse guiding Eleanor gently down the hall had offered a sympathetic smile. "Labor can be overwhelming," she said quietly, trying to soften the moment. But Eleanor knew better. This was not about labor. Her daughter-in-law had disliked her from the very beginning. Daniel Whitaker appeared briefly in the hallway a few minutes later, looking exhausted and conflicted. His scrubs were wrinkled and his hair damp with sweat. He hesitated, glancing back toward the delivery room before approaching his mother. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said softly. Eleanor nodded, though the apology did little to soothe the sting. Daniel always tried to keep peace between the two women, but he rarely succeeded. "Go back to her," Eleanor told him quietly. "She needs you." Daniel squeezed her shoulder once before disappearing behind the door again. And just like that, Eleanor was alone. She had imagined this night for months. Her first grandchild. She had pictured standing beside her son, offering encouragement, maybe holding Claire's hand if she needed it. Instead, she sat in a cold hallway like a stranger waiting for news about someone else's family. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. A clock ticked steadily on the far wall. 2 hours passed. Eleanor watched nurses move through the corridor, their shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Occasionally, one would glance at her with mild curiosity, but none approached. She checked her phone. A message from her neighbor and longtime friend, Judith, blinked on the screen. "Any baby news yet?" Eleanor stared at the text for a long moment before locking the phone without replying. What could she say? That she had been kicked out of the delivery room by the woman carrying her grandchild? That she wasn't even sure if she would be allowed to see the baby afterward? The tension between Eleanor and Claire had existed since the day Daniel first introduced them. Claire had arrived at Eleanor's house wearing a neat gray coat and a polite but guarded smile. She was beautiful, intelligent, and sharply observant. Within minutes, Eleanor noticed the subtle way Claire scanned the modest living room, the aging furniture, the shelves crowded with family photographs, the crocheted blanket Eleanor's late mother had made decades earlier. Claire had been polite, but distant. Every visit afterward seemed to widen the invisible wall between them. When Eleanor cooked dinner, Claire complimented it faintly but rarely finished her plate. When Eleanor suggested family traditions, holiday dinners, Sunday visits, Claire politely changed the subject. When Daniel mentioned converting the guest room into an office, Eleanor understood the message clearly. Over time, Eleanor stopped trying quite so hard. But the distance never closed. Another hour passed. Finally, the door to the delivery room opened. Daniel stepped out again, his face brighter this time despite the exhaustion. "It's a girl," he said, kneeling beside his mother's chair. 7 pounds. Both of them are okay." Relief flooded through Eleanor's chest. "A girl," she whispered. "Her granddaughter." For a moment she allowed herself to imagine holding the tiny baby, feeling the soft warmth of her against her shoulder. "Can I see them?" Eleanor asked gently. Daniel's smile faltered. "Claire's still upset," he admitted. "Maybe tomorrow." Eleanor swallowed the disappointment and nodded. "Of course." Daniel hugged her briefly before returning to the room again. Minutes later, a nurse approached. "Mrs. Whitaker?" "Yes. If you'd like," the nurse said kindly. "The baby is in the nursery for observation. You could see her through the window." Eleanor hesitated only a second before standing. The nursery was quiet, filled with rows of clear bassinets beneath soft lights. Several newborns slept peacefully, wrapped in pastel blankets. "Third one from the right," the nurse said. Eleanor stepped closer to the glass. The baby was impossibly small. Dark hair curled against her tiny head, and her delicate fingers flexed slowly in sleep. Something about her face tugged unexpectedly at Eleanor's memory. A familiar expression. But Eleanor couldn't place it. She lifted her hand and rested it gently against the glass. "Hello there," she whispered. "You don't know me yet, but I've been waiting a long time to meet you." The baby shifted slightly, her tiny mouth opening in a silent yawn. Eleanor smiled through the sudden blur of tears. "Your name will be Olivia," she murmured softly, recalling what Daniel had mentioned weeks earlier. Olivia Grace Whitaker. Grace. The name stirred another memory, one Eleanor had spent years trying not to revisit. 17 years earlier, in a completely different city, Eleanor had volunteered at a community outreach center. One afternoon, a young woman had walked into the building looking fragile and exhausted, clutching a photograph in trembling hands. Her name had been Rachel Porter. Rachel had spoken often about the daughter. The excuses sounded rehearsed, as if Daniel himself wasn't fully convinced by them. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, Eleanor was trimming roses in her backyard when she noticed a familiar sedan pulling into her driveway. Daniel stepped out. Even from a distance, she could see something was wrong. He moved slowly, shoulders slumped, his usually neat hair messy and uncombed. When he reached the porch, Eleanor opened the door before he even had time to knock. "Daniel?" Her son looked up, and the exhaustion in his eyes made her chest tighten. "Mom," he said quietly. She pulled him into a hug. His body felt tense, almost fragile, as if he had been holding himself together through sheer determination. "What's going on?" Eleanor asked, guiding him inside. They sat in the living room where sunlight filtered through lace curtains. For a moment Daniel said nothing, staring at the floor as if trying to organize thoughts that refused to settle. Finally, he sighed deeply. "It's Claire." Eleanor felt a flicker of worry. "Is she sick?" "Not exactly." Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "She's different since the baby was born." Eleanor waited. "At first I thought it was just exhaustion," he continued. "New parents don't sleep much. Everyone says the first few weeks are chaos. But it's more than that." He ran a hand over his face. "She barely holds Olivia. When the baby cries, she freezes, like she doesn't know what to do. Sometimes she just sits there staring at the wall while Olivia screams in the crib." Eleanor's heart sank. "That sounds like postpartum depression," she said gently. "I thought so too," Daniel admitted. "But Claire refuses to talk to her doctor about it. She says she's just tired. She keeps insisting she'll snap out of it." He paused. "Last night I found her sitting in the hallway at 3 in the morning. Olivia had been crying for 20 minutes, and Claire hadn't moved. When I asked why she didn't pick her up, she said something that scared me." Daniel's voice lowered. "She said maybe Olivia would be better off with someone else." The room fell silent. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Eleanor felt a chill crawl through her chest. "Daniel," she said carefully, "those are serious warning signs. She needs professional help." "I know." He stood and began pacing the room. "But she won't listen to me. And I can't keep doing everything alone." Eleanor watched her son move back and forth across the carpet. Daniel had always been responsible, sometimes too responsible. After his father died during Daniel's teenage years, he had stepped into the role of protector without anyone asking him to. Now he looked like a man carrying too much weight again. "Where's Olivia right now?" Eleanor asked. "With Claire's mother," Daniel replied. "She comes over most afternoons, so I can work from home for a few hours." "Does Claire talk to her parents about what she's feeling?" Daniel shook his head. "Not really. They help with practical things, food, cleaning, but they don't talk about emotions much. Claire's always said they avoided those kinds of conversations growing up." Eleanor nodded slowly. Adoptive parents often tried to protect their children by avoiding painful subjects. But silence had its own consequences. Daniel stopped pacing and looked at her. "Mom, I know you and Claire have never gotten along. But right now she needs someone. Someone patient. Eleanor understood what he was asking before he finished the sentence. You want me to try, she said. Daniel hesitated. I know she might slam the door in your face. That wouldn't be the first time someone rejected help, Eleanor said quietly. Daniel looked relieved, though the worry remained in his eyes. Thank you. As he stood to leave, Eleanor asked the question that had been lingering in her mind since the day Olivia was born. Daniel? Yes. Why did Claire choose Grace as Olivia's middle name? Daniel frowned slightly. She said she liked how it sounded. Eleanor watched him carefully. Only that. Daniel hesitated. Well, she also said something else. What? She said you were the most stable person she knew growing up around our family, Daniel admitted. She said stability is rare. The words surprised Eleanor. Claire had always seemed to resent her presence, yet she had chosen a name that quietly honored it. After Daniel left, Eleanor remained sitting in the living room for a long time. Eventually, she walked to her study and opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside lay a pale envelope. Rachel Porter's letter. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Eleanor unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was uneven, written during the final months of Rachel's life when illness had weakened her hands. If you ever meet her again, please tell her something for me. Eleanor read the line slowly. Tell my daughter that giving her away was the only moment in my life when I chose her future over my own. The words still carried the same quiet heartbreak they had years ago. Rachel had feared many things, but one fear appeared repeatedly throughout the letter. Someday she might become a mother herself and believe she's destined to fail the same way I did. Eleanor closed her eyes. That moment might be happening right now. Claire didn't know the truth about her biological mother. She only knew the simplified story given by her adoptive parents, that she had been surrendered because her birth mother couldn't care for her. But the real story was far more complicated, and perhaps far more important now. That evening, Eleanor packed a small basket. Homemade vegetable soup, fresh bread, a soft knitted blanket she had finished months earlier, and a small stuffed rabbit for Olivia. She placed Rachel's letter back into the drawer. Not yet. The truth would come eventually. But first Claire needed something simpler. Help. The next morning Eleanor drove to Daniel's house. The neighborhood looked peaceful under the pale spring sun. Children's bicycles leaned against fences. Wind chimes rang softly from nearby porches. But when Eleanor stepped onto Daniel's porch, she heard something that made her stomach tighten. A baby crying. Not the brief cry of a newborn needing attention. This was a desperate, exhausted wail. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder. Still nothing. The crying continued. After a moment of hesitation, Eleanor tried the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the house was dim and quiet except for Olivia's cries echoing from the hallway. Dishes filled the sink. Laundry lay unfolded on the couch. The air smelled stale, as if windows had not been opened in days. Claire? Eleanor called gently. No response. She followed the sound into the nursery. Olivia lay in her crib, her face red and wet with tears. And on the floor beside the crib sat Claire. Her knees were pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed blankly on the opposite wall. She didn't react when Eleanor entered. For a moment Eleanor simply stood there, stunned. Then she moved quickly to the crib and lifted the crying baby into her arms. Olivia's cries softened almost immediately as Eleanor rocked her gently. Only then did Claire speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't think she likes me. Eleanor turned slowly. Claire's eyes looked hollow with exhaustion. When did you last sleep? Eleanor asked softly. Claire shrugged. I don't remember. Eleanor adjusted Olivia against her shoulder and took a deep breath. The fragile line between past and present suddenly felt thinner than ever. Claire didn't know it yet, but her struggle was frighteningly similar to the one Rachel had described so many years ago. And this time Eleanor had no intention of watching the story repeat itself. The afternoon light filtered softly through the thin curtains of the nursery, casting pale golden shapes across the walls. Eleanor stood near the crib, gently rocking Olivia against her shoulder, while the baby's cries slowly faded into quiet hiccups. Claire remained on the floor where Eleanor had found her back pressed against the wall and her eyes distant, as if she were watching something no one else could see. For several long moments, neither woman spoke. Olivia's breathing steadied, her tiny body relaxing as Eleanor continued to sway back and forth with the slow, practiced rhythm of someone who had soothed many crying children before. Finally, Claire shifted slightly. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. The words weren't angry. They sounded tired. "I knocked," Eleanor replied gently. No one answered. Claire glanced toward the crib, then toward the baby in Eleanor's arms. A shadow of guilt crossed her face. "She wouldn't stop crying," Claire murmured. "That happens," Eleanor said. Claire shook her head weakly. "No, not like that. She cries like she knows something is wrong with me." Eleanor lowered herself into the rocking chair beside the crib. "Babies cry for many reasons," she said calmly. "Hunger, gas, being tired, or sometimes they just need to feel someone close." Claire wrapped her arms around her knees. "I tried," she whispered. "Every time I pick her up, I feel like I'm doing something wrong." Her voice trembled slightly. "It's like there's a wall between us." Eleanor studied her daughter-in-law carefully. Claire looked nothing like the composed, controlled woman she had first met 5 years earlier. Her hair was tangled, her face pale and hollow from exhaustion. The sharp confidence that usually defined her had vanished, replaced by something fragile and uncertain. "You're overwhelmed," Eleanor said quietly. Claire gave a hollow laugh. "That's a polite way of saying I'm failing." "You're not failing. You didn't see me 10 minutes ago." Claire's eyes filled with frustrated tears. She was crying and I just sat here. I couldn't move. I kept thinking that if I touched her I'd make it worse. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Rachel's voice echoed faintly in her memory. "Sometimes I looked at my daughter and felt like I was watching someone else's child, like I didn't deserve to hold her." The similarity was unsettling. "Claire," Eleanor said gently, "have you spoken to your doctor since the baby was born?" Claire stiffened slightly. "I'm not crazy." "No one said you were." "That's what everyone thinks when a woman can't handle motherhood," Claire muttered bitterly. Eleanor shook her head. "Postpartum depression is not weakness. It's a medical condition." Claire didn't respond. Instead, she watched Olivia carefully as the baby stirred and stretched in Eleanor's arms. "How do you do that?" Claire asked after a moment. "What? Hold her like that? She looks calm with you." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Years of practice." Claire studied the gentle motion of Eleanor's rocking. "My mother never did that," she said quietly. "Rock you?" Claire nodded. "I don't remember much from when I was very little. Just flashes." She paused. "But after I was adopted, everything was structured. Schedules, routines, rules." "That's not necessarily bad." "No," Claire admitted. "My parents were good people. They gave me stability." She hesitated. "But they never talked about feelings." Eleanor listened carefully. They believed emotions made things complicated. So if something hurt, the solution was to focus on school or work instead. Claire's gaze drifted toward Olivia again. "I've spent my entire life trying to control everything," she continued quietly. "My career, my routines, my future. And now I have this tiny human being who depends on me for everything, and I don't know what I'm doing." The honesty in her voice surprised Eleanor. Claire had never spoken so openly before. "I keep thinking about my birth mother," Claire admitted after a pause. Eleanor's heart skipped. "What about her?" Claire swallowed. "I don't know anything about her except that she gave me up." She looked at Olivia with a mixture of tenderness and fear. "I can't imagine walking away from my child." The room fell quiet again. Eleanor knew this moment mattered. For years she had guarded the secret about Claire's biological mother, believing silence was the safest choice. But watching Claire struggle now made that decision feel heavier with every passing minute. Still, the truth was delicate. Revealing it too suddenly could do more harm than good. Claire spoke again before Eleanor could respond. "When I look at Olivia," she said softly, "I keep wondering if there's something wrong with me." "Why would you think that?" "Because maybe whatever made my birth mother abandon me is inside me too." Eleanor leaned forward. "Claire, that's not how it works." "You don't know that." Claire's voice sharpened slightly. "Genetics matter. Mental illness runs in families. Addiction, too." She exhaled slowly. "What if I'm just the next version of the same mistake?" Eleanor felt the words settle heavily in the room. Carefully, she placed Olivia back into the crib, where the baby continued sleeping peacefully. Then she turned toward Claire. "Can I ask you something?" Eleanor said quietly. Claire nodded cautiously. "Why do you think your birth mother didn't want you?" Claire looked surprised. "That's the only explanation I've ever been given." "But is it the only possibility?" Claire frowned. "What do you mean?" Eleanor chose her next word slowly. "Sometimes people make decisions that look like abandonment from the outside, but they're actually acts of love." Claire stared at her. "That sounds like something people say to comfort adopted kids." "It might be more than that." Claire's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're speaking like someone who knows something." Eleanor hesitated. For years she had imagined the moment when this truth might surface. But she had never imagined it happening here, inside a messy nursery while a newborn slept nearby. "Claire," she said carefully, "your story might be more complicated than you think." Claire stood slowly. "What does that mean?" Eleanor opened her mouth to respond. But at that moment the front door opened downstairs and Daniel's voice echoed through the house. "Claire? Mom?" The spell broke instantly. Claire stepped back, her expression guarded again. Daniel appeared moments later, looking relieved to see both women. "Oh, thank God," he said, spotting Eleanor holding Olivia's blanket. "I was worried when Claire didn't answer my calls." Claire wiped quickly at her eyes. "I'm fine," she said quietly. Daniel looked uncertain, but didn't press. Instead, he turned to Eleanor. "Mom, thank you for coming." Eleanor nodded. "Of course." Claire glanced between them, clearly sensing the unfinished conversation hanging in the air. But she said nothing. Later that evening, after Eleanor returned home, she opened her desk drawer once again. Rachel Porter's letter rested inside. The secret she had carried for 17 years was beginning to press harder against its boundaries. Sooner or later Claire would need to hear the truth. But Eleanor feared the timing, because the truth about Claire's past might either heal her or break something that had only just begun to mend. In the weeks that followed Eleanor's unexpected visit, life inside Daniel and Claire's home slowly began to shift. The change was not dramatic at first. It came quietly, almost cautiously, like the first signs of spring pushing through frozen ground. Claire began seeing a doctor. The appointment had not been easy to arrange. For several days she resisted Daniel's suggestions, insisting that she simply needed rest. But the memory of sitting helplessly on the nursery floor while Olivia cried seemed to linger in her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. Eventually she agreed to speak with a specialist recommended by the hospital. The diagnosis came quickly: severe postpartum depression. The words frightened Claire at first. She had spent most of her life believing that control and discipline could overcome any weakness. Hearing a doctor explain that her mind itself had been working against her felt like an admission of defeat. But the doctor spoke calmly and clearly. Postpartum depression was not a character flaw. It was a medical condition. Treatment would help. Medication was prescribed carefully, along with therapy sessions and strict encouragement that Claire should never isolate herself with a baby for long periods while she was still recovering. Daniel listened to every instruction carefully, writing notes and asking questions. Eleanor quietly stepped into the role of support whenever she was needed. For the first week, she stayed overnight in the guest room several times, helping with late-night feedings while Daniel slept for a few hours at a time. Claire spent much of those early days resting in the bedroom, her energy drained by exhaustion and emotional strain. But gradually, the fog began to thin. Claire started sitting in the living room while Eleanor fed Olivia. Sometimes she watched silently. Sometimes she asked questions. "How do you know when she's hungry?" she asked one afternoon. "You start recognizing patterns," Eleanor explained while gently bouncing the baby. "Every baby has their own signals." Claire nodded thoughtfully, studying Olivia's tiny expressions. Another day, she stood nearby while Eleanor prepared a bath for the baby. "You make it look easy," Claire said quietly. "It wasn't always," Eleanor replied with a soft smile. "Daniel cried just as loudly when he was born." That comment surprised Claire. "I can't imagine him as a crying baby." Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh, he had strong lungs." For the first time since Olivia's birth, Claire allowed herself to smile. It was small but genuine. As the days passed, Eleanor noticed something else changing as well. Claire's gaze toward Olivia was different now. Less fearful, more curious. One evening while Daniel was preparing dinner, Eleanor sat in the nursery rocking Olivia while humming a quiet lullaby. The melody was old, one Eleanor had learned from her grandmother many years earlier. Claire appeared in the doorway unexpectedly. "What song is that?" she asked. Eleanor looked up. "It's an old lullaby," she said. "My grandmother used to sing it." Claire stepped into the room slowly. "No one ever sang to me," she said. The statement wasn't bitter, just factual. Eleanor gestured gently toward the rocking chair beside her. "Would you like to try?" Claire hesitated. "I don't think she'd like that." "You might be surprised." Eleanor carefully stood and placed Olivia into Claire's arms. The moment felt delicate. Claire held the baby stiffly at first, clearly afraid of doing something wrong. "Just breathe," Eleanor said softly. Claire sat down and began rocking slowly. At first her voice was barely audible as she tried to follow the lullaby Eleanor had just sung. But Olivia didn't cry. Instead, the baby blinked slowly, staring up at her mother's face. Claire's expression shifted. For the first time, something like recognition passed between them. "She's looking at me," Claire whispered. "Of course she is," Eleanor replied. "You're her mother." A tear slipped down Claire's cheek. "I want to be good at this." "You already are," Eleanor said gently. "You're trying." Later that evening, Claire approached Eleanor in the kitchen. Daniel had taken Olivia into the living room while preparing bottles. Claire leaned quietly against the counter. "Earlier you said something strange," she said after a moment. Eleanor paused while chopping vegetables. "What was that?" "You said sometimes adoption isn't about abandonment," Claire said slowly. "You sounded like you knew something specific." Eleanor's hands stilled. The moment she had avoided for years was approaching faster than she expected. Claire studied her carefully. "You do know something, don't you?" Before Eleanor could respond, Olivia began crying from the living room and Daniel called for help. Claire glanced toward the sound, then back at Eleanor. "We'll finish this conversation later," she said. And for the first time, there was no hostility in her voice, only curiosity. The following weeks passed quietly. Claire continued therapy. Her medications stabilized her mood. And slowly, motherhood began to feel less terrifying. She still had difficult days. But the moments of connection with Olivia were becoming stronger. Sometimes Eleanor would catch Claire sitting in the nursery long after the baby had fallen asleep, simply watching her breathe. One rainy afternoon, several weeks later, Eleanor arrived at the house to find Daniel hurriedly putting on his coat. "Emergency at work," he explained. "Server crash. I'll be back in a few hours." Claire and Olivia were upstairs sleeping. Eleanor nodded. "I'll keep an eye on things." After Daniel left, Eleanor began tidying the living room quietly. A soft voice behind her suddenly broke the silence. "How long have you known?" Eleanor turned. Claire stood in the hallway. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. "Knew what?" Eleanor asked carefully. Claire stepped forward slowly. "About my birth mother." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race. Claire held a folded piece of paper in her hand. I found this in Daniel's desk, she said. Recognition hit Eleanor instantly. The unsent letter. Years ago, Eleanor had written a letter to Daniel explaining that she believed she had once met Claire's biological mother. She had never mailed it, deciding it wasn't her place to interfere in Claire's past. But somehow Daniel had found it. You wrote that you met her, Claire continued quietly. That she showed you my picture. Her voice trembled slightly. Why would you keep that from me? Eleanor took a slow breath. Sit down, Claire, she said gently. This is not a short story. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, tense but determined. Eleanor sat across from her. 17 years of silence finally began to unravel. I met a woman named Rachel Porter at a community recovery center, Eleanor began. Claire's eyes didn't leave her face. She was struggling with addiction and mental illness. She joined a support group I helped run. Eleanor paused briefly. One day she told us about the daughter she had given up for adoption. Claire's hands tightened around the paper. She told you my name? Yes. And showed you my picture? Eleanor nodded. You were 3 years old in that photograph. Claire swallowed hard. Why did she give me up? Eleanor answered gently. Because she was afraid she might hurt you. The words hung heavily in the room. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Rachel suffered from severe postpartum depression after you were born, Eleanor continued, combined with untreated bipolar disorder and addiction. Claire stared at the floor. So she abandoned me. No, Eleanor said firmly. She kept you for 3 years. She fought to stay stable long enough to raise you. But eventually she realized you deserved a safer life than the one she could provide. Claire's voice cracked. So she gave me a way out of love? Yes. Eleanor hesitated before adding quietly. She wrote you a letter before she died. Claire looked up sharply. She's dead. She died 15 years ago. Claire covered her mouth with trembling fingers. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she whispered, Everything I believed about my past might be wrong. Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes. Claire leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling. I don't know how to feel about that. You don't have to decide right now, Eleanor said softly. Claire closed her eyes. But one thing is clear. What? I'm not the first mother in my family to be afraid. The baby monitor crackled suddenly as Olivia began crying upstairs. Claire stood slowly. I need to go to her. She paused before leaving the room. I think I'd like to read that letter. Eleanor nodded. When you're ready. Claire climbed the stairs quietly. And for the first time since Eleanor had carried Rachel's secret all those years ago, the truth no longer belonged to her alone. For several weeks after the conversation in the living room, Eleanor heard almost nothing from Claire. Daniel called occasionally, usually late in the evening after Olivia had fallen asleep. His voice carried a mixture of confusion and cautious optimism. She's thinking a lot, he told his mother during one call. She's reading the letter you gave her. Over and over. Eleanor didn't press for details. Some truths needed quiet space to settle. Meanwhile, spring deepened across Brookhaven. Eleanor spent long mornings in her small garden, trimming roses and planting new flowers along the wooden fence. The rhythm of gardening gave her something steady to focus on while her thoughts wandered through memories of Rachel Porter. She often wondered what Rachel would think if she could see her daughter now. Claire had grown into a strong, intelligent woman despite the painful beginning of her life. Rachel had always feared that her struggles would somehow follow her daughter into adulthood. And in some ways they had. But Claire also had something Rachel never did. Support. One Saturday morning, nearly a month after the truth had been revealed, Eleanor was kneeling in the garden when the sound of a car pulling into her driveway caught her attention. She looked up. Daniel's car. Her heart jumped. The passenger door opened first. Claire stepped out, carefully lifting Olivia from the back seat. The baby was bundled in a soft pink blanket, her tiny face peeking out curiously at the world. Daniel followed with the diaper bag slung over his shoulder. Eleanor stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. Claire approached the garden path, stopping a few feet away. "Hello, Eleanor," she said quietly. The formality of the greeting made Eleanor slightly nervous. "Hello, Claire." Claire shifted Olivia gently in her arms. "I hope it's all right that we came without calling." "Of course it is," Eleanor said warmly. "You're always welcome." They moved inside the house together. The living room felt brighter than usual with the windows open and the fresh scent of spring air drifting inside. Claire sat carefully on the couch, adjusting the blanket around Olivia while Daniel placed the diaper bag nearby. For a moment no one spoke. Then Claire looked up. "I read Rachel's letter." Eleanor sat across from her, listening. "I've read it many times actually," Claire continued. "The first time I was angry." She paused. "Angry at her. Angry at you. Angry at my adoptive parents for not telling me more about where I came from." Daniel rested his hand gently on her shoulder. Claire glanced down at Olivia sleeping peacefully in her arms. "But the more I read it, the more I started noticing something."
"What?"
Eleanor asked softly. "The way she writes." Claire gave a faint smile. "It's strange, but our sentences sound similar. The way she explains things. Even some of the words she chooses." Eleanor nodded slowly. Rachel loved reading and poetry. Claire's eyes widened slightly. "So do I." Another small silence passed. "The Chens always thought that was unusual," Claire admitted. "They're both engineers. Very practical people." Daniel chuckled softly. "That explains why your bookshelves look like a library." Claire smiled briefly at him before turning serious again. "For a long time, I believed my biological mother didn't care about me," she continued. "That she just didn't want the responsibility." Her voice softened. "But the letter changed that." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "What did you understand differently?" Claire took a slow breath. "She didn't give me up because she didn't love me," she said. "She gave me up because she loved me enough to realize she couldn't give me a safe life." Eleanor felt her chest tighten with emotion. That's exactly what she hoped you would understand someday. Claire looked at Olivia again. "Before I became a mother, I probably wouldn't have believed it." "Why not?" "Because I couldn't imagine how someone could love their child and still walk away." Claire brushed a finger gently across Olivia's cheek. "But after the way I felt those first weeks, the fear, the emptiness, I can almost understand how desperate she must have been." Daniel squeezed her shoulder again. "You're not her," he said quietly. "I know," Claire replied. "And that's the important part." She looked back at Eleanor. "Rachel didn't have the help I have." Eleanor nodded. "No treatment. No support system.
"No stability."
Claire continued slowly. "But I do." She glanced at Daniel. "And I have people who stayed." Her gaze shifted back to Eleanor. "You stayed too, even when I pushed you away." Eleanor felt a sudden lump rise in her throat. "I never stopped caring about you, Claire." Claire studied her face carefully. "I know that now." The room felt warmer somehow. Claire adjusted Olivia in her arms and then stood. "Would you like to hold her?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "Are you sure?" Claire nodded. "Yes." She stepped forward and carefully placed Olivia into Eleanor's waiting arms. The baby stirred slightly, but remained calm. Eleanor looked down at her granddaughter's small face. For a moment she thought of Rachel again. The same dark eyes. The same quiet expression. 3 generations connected by choices none of them could fully control. "She's growing fast," Eleanor said softly. Claire smiled faintly. "She eats like Daniel." Daniel laughed. "Hey, I take that as a compliment." They sat together for a while, talking about small things, sleep schedules, doctor visits, Olivia's first attempts at smiling. Eventually, Daniel spoke again. "We were thinking about starting a Sunday tradition." Eleanor looked up. "What kind of tradition?" "Dinner," Daniel said. "Here or at her place?" "Just family." Claire nodded. "I want Olivia to grow up with a sense of connection," she explained. "Stories about where she comes from." Her voice softened. "I spent most of my life feeling like part of my story was missing." Eleanor understood immediately. You don't want her to feel that way.
No.
Claire hesitated before continuing. I've started writing letters to her. Letters? Claire nodded. About everything. My childhood, my struggles, Rachel's story, the truth. Daniel looked slightly surprised but supportive. I want Olivia to understand her family history honestly, Claire said. That's brave, Eleanor replied. It's necessary. A comfortable silence settled around them. Eventually, Daniel began gathering their things. Olivia was placed back into her car seat, wrapped carefully in her blanket. As they stepped onto the front porch, Claire lingered beside Eleanor for a moment while Daniel walked ahead to the car. I was wrong about you, Claire said quietly. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. How so? When I first met you, Claire admitted, I thought your confidence as a mother meant you would judge me. Eleanor shook her head gently. I've made plenty of mistakes. Claire smiled faintly. Maybe, but you never ran away from them. She hesitated. I think I was afraid of that stability. It reminded me of everything I thought I lacked. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Claire's arm. You have it now. Claire looked at Olivia in the car seat. Yes, she said softly. Then she turned back to Eleanor. Thank you for keeping Rachel's story safe all those years. Eleanor nodded. She trusted me with it, and now it belongs to me too. Claire stepped forward and hugged her briefly. It wasn't a long embrace, but it was real. After the car drove away, Eleanor remained on the porch watching the quiet street. The secret she had carried for nearly 2 decades was no longer a burden she held alone. Instead, it had become something different. A bridge between past and future, between 3 women connected not just by blood, but by the courage to face painful truths and still choose love. Inside the house, the afternoon sunlight spilled across the empty living room. And for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt certain that the story of this family was only just beginning.